Warrior of Blade and Dusk, The Junning High Chronicles Book 2, by Anastasis Blythe, narrated by Talon David and Lucas Arnold. For my own yeah, and the wonderful years we had together, the world lost one of its best men on November 5th, 2022. Chapter 1.
Kissing Aranya had definitely not been on the list of things Kai planned to do today. His plans had involved running as far away from his family and Gabe as he could, finding a way to free Aranya from the spelled vines that bound her wrists and ankles, and then collapsing onto a bed and sleeping until the Festival of New Lights. Of course, his comrades likely had plans to discuss important things, like what in the Seven Valleys was a princess doing in his family's dungeon, who this rebel leader Fang Zedong was, and how his mother and brother had gotten entangled with him. Delan probably wasn't finished scolding him for various things, so that was likely on the agenda too. But kissing Aranya? Nope. That wasn't to say he had never thought about kissing her, because he had. More times than he'd like to admit. But thinking about kissing her and planning on kissing her were two entirely separate things. It was a knee-jerk reaction. He was standing there with Aranya, with her poor, swollen, and discolored hands, while she tried not to give in to discouragement when the Cursebreaker was unable to help her. He teased her, trying to get her mind off how miserable she must be. It seemed to be working too, when he returned from fetching her food and earned a particularly vicious glare from her. But then he looked beyond her, across the street, and the recognition slapped him harder than a blow. Those brown eyes, the short cropped hair she'd always worn, the perpetual downward tilt of her mouth, and the line between her eyebrows. Jie had always wanted him to take his place with his family. When they had been together, she had pushed him, nagged him, refused to understand why he wanted nothing to do with his rich parentage, why he wanted none of the prestige. He tried to explain, had nearly shared everything with her once, before he discovered that she'd snitched on him to his brother Young. That was the final straw. He cut ties with her, and was desperately relieved he hadn't divulged his secrets to her in a faulty attempt to make her understand. Jie stood across the street. Her jaw dropped at the sight of him. And then she was smiling, as if they were long-lost lovers finally reunited. Kai's face must have shown something, because Aranya said, "What's wrong? Please don't tell me your brother is behind me." "Oh, no, definitely not," he said quickly. But running into Jie was the next worst thing after running into Young or Mother. Aranya's brow went taut with a question she didn't want to ask. She started to turn, and that movement was enough to send a flash of panic down his spine. Not again. Not again. He couldn't open Aranya up to his family's schemes and abuse again. He couldn't let them hurt her. And he refused to let Jie be the means through which Young got his hands on Aranya for a second time. He grabbed her shoulders, forcing her to not move. And the instant her confused and concerned gaze met his, the idea assaulted him. One kiss. Right here, right now, in front of Jie. Maybe then Jie would leave them alone. Maybe she would see that when he had said it was over, he meant it. Maybe she would finally move on and leave him alone. Jie looked away, checking for carts, before she stepped into the street, coming straight for him, with a broad smile on her face. The words were spewing out of Kai's mouth before he could think of anything else. "Remember that fine your grandfather accrued that you couldn't pay in Sushui? How did you know about that? I didn't tell. I paid it. Now, you what?" Jie was almost halfway across the street. "I'm calling in my debt. Just forgive me in advance, all right? Kai, what in the seven? Please don't hate me. He breathed too quietly for her to hear as he pulled her into his arms and ducked his head to press his mouth to hers. She grabbed his shirt with both of her fists, and for a second, he thought she was going to push him away, which was definitely better than her skewering him with her talons. But if she rebuffed him, Jie wouldn't get the message. So he caught her face in his hands and deepened the kiss. That time in the woods that Aranya had called a kiss, when their lips had barely brushed for 1 second, not a kiss. This was a kiss. He'd show her the difference. I'll show you a real kiss. Her grip on his shirt loosened, the resistance flowing out of her like water poured from a glass, so much that she stumbled, and Kai's arm shot out instinctively to catch her, his fingers looping around her knife belt to keep her steady. His heart, which had just been hammering a frantic, erratic rhythm, now soared in the sunset-stained clouds above them. She wanted this. The realization was intoxicating, turning him lightheaded and dizzy as he kissed her. His thoughts raced ahead, voicing things in his mind he would never dare speak aloud. I'd kiss you like this every day for the rest of your life, if you wanted. A sudden fear stabbed his chest. What if he was misreading her? What if she didn't want this? What if... He pulled back and opened his eyes. Hers stayed closed for a heartbeat longer. Her lips parted, her throat bobbing as she swallowed. Then her eyes opened, and there were unshed tears glimmering on her lower lashes. Tears? What did this mean? Nothing could cut him to the quick like the sight of her tears. But what did they mean? He wanted to ask her what was wrong, if he should stop, if he should keep kissing her. His throat clogged, preventing him from getting words out. Instead, he leaned down again, nuzzling his nose into hers. Are you all right? Have I upset you? A tiny sound escaped her as she closed her eyes and lifted her lips to his. Shock turned his ears red hot, but he wasn't about to hesitate and ruin everything. Not when his soul had just come alive. He kissed her again, gently, as one of her tears escaped and slid over his knuckles. Oh, Aranya. If Young had dreamed of lifting a finger against her again, Kai was going to rip him to shreds, and anyone else who meant her harm. Jie. The name was like an unwelcome guest showing up at the door and expecting supper. He'd forgotten all about her, even though she was the reason he was kissing Aranya. But before he had a chance to pull away, she suddenly shoved back against his chest, breaking their kiss and nearly toppling herself over. What was that? She dashed away her tears with the side of her swollen thumb. Oh no, she was angry. But she hadn't been angry a moment ago. She'd very clearly asked for the second kiss, and... His mind scrabbled to understand what just happened, like he was falling off a cliff and clawing for any purchase on crumbling rocks. Had he misread her so grievously? He must have, which meant he couldn't let her see the way her lips had just imprinted themselves on his soul. The only reliable shield now was a smirk. He donned one the bare instant before she looked up at him and glared. It wasn't just anger on her face. It was hurt, embarrassment, if the color of her cheeks was any testament, and plenty of other things. She sniffled. His gut dropped straight to the earth. Dragons blast it. He'd screwed up. Badly. But then, her bonds fell off, like he just sliced his knife through them, like they hadn't been uncuttable mere seconds ago. It took several more seconds for his brain to catch up with what he was seeing. The Yanshao technique. A kiss to break the spell. Of course, 7 Valleys. He should have kissed her ages ago. Why hadn't he thought of it? They had been rather preoccupied. Fathers, he breathed as she rotated her wrists. They needed to get her medical attention as soon as possible to restore the function and vitality to her hands and feet. She'd probably have scars where those bonds bit into her skin. Her head snapped up, her gaze locking on his. Why did you kiss me, Shakai? What is wrong with you? I'm not one of your dalliances. 7 Valleys, I'm your colleague. She was mad because he'd crossed a professional line? It seemed like it was something else. But now that they were done kissing, there was nothing to distract him from the frozen Gia in the street behind Aranya. He leveled a look at Gia, a look that was probably colder than it needed to be. One that told her very clearly that when he'd broken things off 2 years ago with her, he'd meant it, and she'd better move on. Gia's gaze shifted from him to Aranya as she turned to follow his gaze. Aranya's mouth fell open. This was getting far too messy, far too quickly. Kai snatched her elbow and dragged her toward their horses. Come on, he growled. Here come the questions. It wasn't even like he could claim to have been performing the Yanshao technique. Both of them knew that hadn't been his intention. Who was that? Do you know her? Why did you? He didn't want to tell her. But if he didn't tell her, she would keep pestering him, and he'd drive the wedge of distrust between them even deeper than it already was. He exhaled between gritted teeth and yanked the buckle tighter on his saddle. She and I... How could he describe it? She was going to hate him. We were involved back at the academy. I didn't... I guess she thought it was serious. Wait, you courted at the academy? I didn't court. At least, I didn't think it was. And you just used me to get back at her? You used us both! This was going even worse than he'd imagined. She's been insistent. Years later. I've told her no 1,000 times and she won't listen. And she knows my family and... Look, you saw my family. Spitfire! He spat out the curse under his breath. I'm sorry, Aranya. I shouldn't... It was all I could think of. She's gone behind my back more than once to tell my mother... This wasn't working. It sounded worse saying it than just staying quiet. Kai shut his mouth and focused his gaze on untethering their horses, the weight of her stare heavy on the back of his head. When he couldn't keep avoiding it, he brought his eyes to meet hers. At least, you're free now, he said, and hated himself for how lame the words sounded. She turned away from him, facing down the street where Gia disappeared. Her hands clenched and unclenched like she was fighting the instinct to shapeshift. He ground his jaw. Why was he being so defensive? He'd kissed her without her consent. For that and that alone he owed her an apology. But obliging her request for a second kiss? That was different. And it wasn't his fault she was embarrassed. Besides, he kissed her to protect her. And the result was that her bonds had fallen off. She couldn't blame him for everything. He crossed his arms over his chest and leveled a glare at the back of her head. Fine. If she wanted to argue, to be angry, then very well. He'd be angry back. She whirled to face him again, lifted her chin, and said, This isn't over, Evanescer. Who said it was, partial? He said, his mouth spreading in a dark smile. Catch this. He tossed her the lead of her horse. She snatched it out of the air. We've got to get out of here.
Chapter 2. They walked down the darkening street in the direction Dalan had disappeared. Aranya stormed ahead, leaving Kai to trail behind her. She wouldn't look. She wouldn't. She would focus on finding Delon, on searching for him between donkey-hitched carts and milling people in long robes and laughing children running underfoot. Her eyes betrayed her. She glanced back once. Cool hazel eyes met hers, bright in the golden glow of evening. Yes? Her mouth opened, something knotting tightly in her chest and warmth crawling up her neck. Then, slamming her jaw shut with a click, she whirled on her heel and marched forward. It didn't matter what he thought of their kiss. In fact, it was stupid if he thought anything at all. Even stupider if she thought about it. If it's another kiss you're wanting, you just have to ask. Her face flamed, but she wouldn't give him the satisfaction of even a glare. If you asked, I'd say yes, eventually. Now, I might say no a few times, just to be sure you meant it when you ask. But if you keep asking, eventually I'll say yes. Eventually, if you throw in a little begging. Kai, Aranya growled, stopping in the middle of the street so his horse almost bumped into hers. She looked over her shoulder at him so fast her braids swung and slapped her neck. He blinked innocently at her. She lifted one of her tingling hands in a fist and flashed a brief glimpse of her talons. One more word, and I'll kill you. Nearby, a chicken squawked and a few heads turned. Aranya ignored them. Kai lifted an eyebrow. In broad daylight? I'm afraid that's illegal, love. That last word did strange things to her stomach. Before she could do anything embarrassing, she whirled back around and marched forward, determined to ignore him no matter how he goaded her. Finding Delon didn't take long. He was easily recognizable atop his horse, despite the shadowed streets of the city. He looked even more exhausted than Aranya felt. His hair stood out in frazzled angles, his robes torn at the shoulders, and his eyes the color of weary storm clouds. The moment he saw them and her free limbs, his eyebrows shot skyward. How? He gasped. How'd you get them off? Heat flared in her cheeks, but her explosion of frustration immediately covered it. She pointed back at Kai. He kissed me. Kai shrugged. Yes, I kissed her to break them off. Liar! That was not the reason. He was trying to get back at a girl he saw whom apparently he made out with a bunch at the academy. That is not what I said, Kai snapped. She wouldn't stop, not even for the anger in his tone. And he decided he was calling in some sort of debt that I didn't know he'd paid. Lights above, Kai, but you couldn't have told me? I'll pay you back. You already paid it, he said matter-of-factly. She stared, her jaw dropping open. Delon sat on his horse in shocked stillness. She found her hands fidgeting, not caring how the movement brought pain. The ground was suddenly the most compelling thing she'd ever seen. It was one matter to have this happen. It was another entirely to relay it all to Delon and let his staunch displeasure roll over them like the waves over Suguan's shore. The silence stretched out. Finally, Aranya peeked a glance at Kai. He was smirking at her. Heat flooded her face, her neck, even as dread sank into her gut. Whatever he was about to say, "You enjoyed it," he drawled. That snide retort hit her like a punch to her gut. He looked away from her, his face composed nonchalance. This was the infamous academy flirt, the one who used girls and dumped them on the wayside. Aranya was a fool for ever thinking. She shook her head, gritting her teeth. Delon groaned, running a square hand down his face. He sounded oddly like Qigong, their Tsushui supervisor, as he muttered, "What a mess. Kai, what were you thinking?" A muscle in Kai's jaw clenched. I agree it's a mess, but her bonds are off, and now we can go back to our mission. Since our relationships are merely professional, this will change nothing. He stalked forward with his horse in tow and swept his cloak behind him. He didn't look at Aranya. Fury mounted like the pounding of horse hooves in her chest. Oh, this changed everything, but not in the way Kai was thinking. He could attempt to fluster her all he wanted, calling her love and whatnot. But she wasn't going to be just another girl in line for his heart, especially when he described their relationship as merely professional. Delon fixed him with an icy glare.
Take care that it doesn't change anything.
Kai met his gaze evenly. Was that protectiveness flashing in Delon's face? A tiny bit of the tension in Aranya's chest eased.
It's late. We'd better decide where we're staying tonight,
Delon said.
Kai's heart hammered. He hoped his sweaty hands weren't obvious. For a few minutes, they stood around their horses and exchanged curt, tense suggestions, the air hanging heavy over their party. It gave him time to recoup his fractured composure, to pretend he didn't notice the bubbling hurt and fury in Aranya's eyes. Then, two wielders slinked out of the shadows of an alleyway and nearly ruined his composure all over again. He recognized the gait of one immediately. Things had just gone from bad to worse. A quick glance at Aranya revealed that she recognized the girl too. Kai drew a deep breath, trying to bolster his courage as they turned to acknowledge the newcomers. This is really, really bad. Gia was the first to step out of the shadows, her face hard and firm. She looked down her pointed nose, one large freckle above her upper lip, with an upturned sharp chin. Before she'd ratted him out to his family, he'd found her pretty. Next to her, a male warden casually rested his hands on the hilts of the knives in his belt, adjusting his stance like a posturing peacock. Gia didn't look at Kai or Aranya, but addressed herself to Delon. "We are here to arrest you three for disturbing the peace by causing a scene outside the Cursebreaker's hut." Delon scoffed, waving a hand through the air.
"It's only a misunderstanding. I apologize for the earlier ruckus, but we're wielders too, and we're in a predicament."
"You can explain yourself before a judge. If you're lucky, they'll have hearings tomorrow." Kai wanted to groan. Why had he ever thought kissing Aranya would fix things with Gia? He should have known she would turn around and do something like this. Now, both of them hated him. Well, he hated them too. At Gia's statement, Aranya's eyes went wide, her hands fisting by her side, her poor wrists looking horrid and painful, but she almost didn't seem to notice them. Delon's face hardened, his jaw flexing. Kai willed Gia to look at him, willed her to stop being an idiot, to stop being so driven by whatever whim of intense emotion overcame her moment by moment. But that had always been Gia, always letting emotion get in the way of everything. There had been a time when he wasn't sure a rational thought had ever entered her mind. He knew better now. She was half psychopath. He'd been a fool to think he could use her to convince his family of his wayward nature. He'd been a fool to ever think his father would believe the reputation he'd created for himself at the academy was a proper reflection of his character. He would have been better off ignoring girls like Young had. He'd been a fool then, and he was a fool now.
"We're on business from the capital."
Delon tried again, gruffer this time.
"These two here are wardens from Zushui. You ought not to delay us."
Kai's gut sank into his boots. Fathers. "Both from Zushui?" Gia said, blinking her eyes and letting them rove in a long assessment over Aranya. They flicked briefly to Kai, and though they didn't look directly into his, the strength of her attention on him was palpable. Kai wished he dared step forward in front of Aranya, to take away that malicious gaze from her, but such an action would only make things worse. Besides, Aranya was busy meeting Gia's stare with her own. After a second, Aranya grinned and stepped forward, putting out a hand. "Hi, I'm Swan Aranya. This is Leigh Delan and Kai." He barely kept himself from shaking his head at how obviously out of place her chipper greeting was. Unlike most people, she faced her enemies with bright smiles. Usually. An image flashed in his mind of a knife flicking beneath her eye, the wicked grin of his older brother dancing behind her, the panic in her face. His stomach twisted, and he blinked it away. Gia eyed Aranya's proffered hand with obvious disdain. The male warden's eyes darted between them, as though waiting for an explosion to happen. Surely, he realized something of what his comrade was. Gia sniffed and stepped aside, gesturing down the road. "Come with us, wardens of Tsushui, and Lian Delan, from the capital. Let us clear up this misunderstanding at the ward post." "You may bring your horses," the other warden said. Kai and Delan shared a look of thick annoyance over Aranya's head. Hopefully, that concealed the terror flooding his veins. With a sigh that rattled through his body, he made to follow. "What are you doing?" Aranya hissed, grabbing his arm. He jerked free from her touch, just in time, before Gia turned a suspicious eye toward them. Aranya scratched her temple, then gave a quick nod as realization hit. Since the kiss had backfired, more touching would only make things worse. She didn't speak again, though the question filled her eyes. Why? Before Delan could answer and claim her attention, Kai muttered, "This is their jurisdiction." "I know that," she growled back, her and Delan falling into step beside him with their horses. "I know they have a right to take us in, but why aren't we protesting more? We're on a—" Kai silenced her with a sudden, frantic look. His attention darted forward to Gia. She hadn't turned. "Feral," he mouthed to Aranya and Delan. Both of them looked alarmed, realizing that she could probably hear every word they spoke. The last thing they needed was Gia knowing that they were on a Secret Service's mission. Not only would it compromise their secrecy, having a low-level person like her know, but she could relay that information onto his family. Gia would do anything to get him to comply with his family's wishes. She wanted him to take his rightful place at his brother's side, because that would have afforded Kai's wife a higher position in society. No matter that Gia was never, ever, ever going to be that. She seemed to believe it remained her destined fate. The look Delan gave the back of Gia's head told Kai he had some very choice words for her supervisor. But then, Delan glanced at Kai, clearly having just made the connection. His eyes widened, and he pointed subtly between Kai and Gia, raising his eyebrows in question. If only Kai hadn't had to tell them Gia was feral, he might have gotten away without Delan realizing who this girl was. Too late. Delan's glare was like icicles, silently demanding why he dragged this drama into their mission, as if it was Kai's fault or choice that they'd run into her. Her, of all people. As if it was his fault she was the vengeful girl she was. As if it was his fault his family was. His family. The ward post loomed before them, bigger than Tsushui ward post, with lanterns lit along the outside against the advancing evening. Kai tried to shove away the twisting of his stomach. If he couldn't get Gia to be silent, his family would find out exactly where he had fled this time. Vanishing again would be so much more difficult.
Chapter 3. Her horse in tow, Aranya trudged behind the girl, Kai's former something, and tried not to think about how much her wrists and ankles still hurt, how exhausted she was, and how much she only wanted to flop in a comfortable bed and rest. Instead, she eyed the colorful robes of a wealthy lord as he stepped out of his litter and entered what seemed to be an exclusive drinking establishment. Anything to distract her from how furious she was at Kai. Had it been only an hour or two ago that she'd been asleep against his chest while they shared a saddle? She was so stupid. Instead of a break after a very long day, this girl and her fellow warden were talking of incarcerating them because Delon yelled outside the Cursebreaker's house. Except, Aranya knew better. It was because of Kai and their history. It was plain in the girl's eyes whenever she looked at Aranya, whenever she didn't look at Kai. Unconsciously, for probably the 12th time in the last hour, she swiped her arm across her lips, as if to wipe away the memory of that kiss. It was the last thing she wanted to think about. She would pretend it hadn't happened. The girl and the other warden herded the three of them up the ward post steps, but not through the main entrance where the supervisor would be waiting and where warm light spilled out onto the wooden slats of the porch. They started to lead them away, toward the barred incarceration unit between the warden's side of the complex and the judiciary side. Were they truly intending to lock an Evanescer in a cell? Delon planted his feet firmly and growled,
"We must speak with the supervisor."
"Not tonight, I'm afraid," the girl said without turning her head. "Tomorrow morning, perhaps. We can request an audience for you, if you'd like." At this, she did twist enough to look back at them. Her eyes landed not on Delon, nor on Kai, but on Aranya. Her gaze pierced hard, loaded with an emotion that Aranya couldn't distinguish. She could tell, however, that this girl had no intention whatsoever of telling their supervisor.
"Warden,"
Delon said, his voice full of warning.
"You do not want to delay us."
"If there has been a misunderstanding, it will be cleared up before the courts. Like everything else." Kai's face went quite pale. He blinked, catching Aranya's look. Just as quickly, his gaze darted away, over her head. Delon crossed his arms over his chest.
"I'm afraid this arrangement isn't going to work. I have official summons from Suguan that I can show your supervisor. We can have this cleared up in just a few minutes."
"Like I said, you can explain to the courts." So Kai had been involved with an idiot. Aranya wasn't sure if this made her feel better or worse about him kissing her. Probably worse. Delon's gaze snapped to Kai's, and he jerked his head backward, silently telling him to evanesce away to the supervisor's office. Aranya expected him to immediately vanish and save them from this mess. Instead, he stayed where he was, face going even paler. Delon shot him a look, gesturing with his hands to hurry. Kai's eyes darted to the girl leading them. He is afraid of her. He was not simply avoiding awkwardness because of their history. No, she, Kai, for whatever reason, was actually scared of her, like she held some power over him. Memory of the fragments he'd sputtered after their kiss floated through her mind. He'd said something about his family. She'd been too flustered to listen to what he was saying, but now pieces came back, making her blood run cold. Were they on the verge of another confrontation with Yang and Lady Shi? Oh, fathers, Aranya didn't think she could do that again for a while. Or ever. Kai drew a deep breath and, with a final glance ahead at the girl, vanished. The moment he did, both the girl and her fellow warden whirled. Delon put his hands up, arching one eyebrow.
"You put us in an awkward position. What could you expect? Even you should know that there's no containing an Evanescer."
Aranya winced at the insult. The girl lifted her chin. Her comrade straightened his shoulders, and his hands slid conspicuously to the weapons on his belt. "This is how things are going to be, then?" the girl growled. Delon shrugged.
I'm afraid so.
A new light entered the girl's eye, nearly manic and full of hatred. They landed on Aranya. I am going to murder that Shikai. At least they could agree there.
Murder is illegal, I'm afraid,
said Delon, unperturbed. Aranya's hand drifted to the knife at her belt. She could shift, of course, but they didn't know she was a shifter. It was probably better to wait before revealing that. She widened her stance, mirroring the two wardens' aggressive postures. Delon alone remained cool, one leg crossed over the other. His arms were folded across his chest. Only his face, however, was furious. Forward, the girl barked, jerking her head. Delon sniffed.
No.
Aranya braced herself, readying for a fight, waiting for the moment Kai would bring the supervisor out to rescue them. The girl seemed to realize they only had moments. She drew her knife and leapt at Aranya. Come, now, she snarled. Aranya whipped out her own knife in time to deflect the blow. She almost hadn't been quick enough. She wasn't expecting the girl to actually try to injure her. While Aranya forced her knife up, the girl withdrew a second in her other hand and stabbed toward her exposed stomach. Aranya let out a cry, shifting her left hand just enough to swipe the second blow aside. Fury roared in her blood, driving her knee up to hit the girl sharply in the thigh. Thankfully, though the girl was feral, her abilities did not include unnatural strength. She was still strong, but so was Aranya. In her periphery, the second warden attacked Delon. She wondered at their idiocy. Did they want to be dismissed? Or would feigning innocence be enough to get them free without punishment? The girl surprised Aranya with a quick maneuver, knocking the knife out of her hand. In the process, she hit her raw wrist hard. Aranya cried out at the sudden pain, but she swallowed it with a growl, shifting her other hand and leaping to catch the girl's wrists. She was quick to evade one of Aranya's snatching hands, but Aranya's adrenaline surged, nearly overcoming her rational thought. She snarled like a wildcat, jumping sidelong and using her grip on the girl's one wrist to wheel her around and slam her into the ward post wall. The girl landed hard, barely catching herself with a fist around the hilt of her knife before she crashed her nose into stone. Aranya twisted the girl's arm behind her, avoiding the knife point. She pinned her other wrist to the wall, leaning her weight against the girl. She gasped when the girl tried to twist the knife she gripped behind her to plunge it into her stomach, but with a burst of strength that made sweat break out on her forehead, she forced the girl's wrist to twist and let go of the knife. It clattered to the ground. They stood there, panting for air, as the sound of hurrying footsteps echoed around them. The girl sagged in Aranya's restraining grip, but Aranya didn't fall for the girl's trick. She tightened her hold, pressing her weight more firmly against her. Only then did she look around. Delon had pinned the other warden beneath him on the ground, holding him at knife point beside one of the porch's supporting pillars. More wardens ran toward them, led by Kai and another man, one with a top knot and a receding hairline, who must be the supervisor. Kai's eyes rounded when he saw them, his gaze flicking from where Aranya had his former darling love pinned against the wall to her sidekick incapacitated by Delon. The supervisor barked angrily.
What is happening?
Carefully, so she wasn't stabbed, Aranya eased away from the girl and backed up a few steps. She kept a wary eye on her, but at Kai's quick look, she obliged his unspoken request and shifted her talons away.
Ah, what a relief,
Delon growled, picking himself up off the ground and offering a hand to the warden.
We need to speak with you, Supervisor. Away from these incompetent lackeys.
Kai visibly stiffened, and Aranya tensed at the insult. But the supervisor pursed his lips and nodded tensely.
I shall speak to them later. Go back to West Patrol, you two.
It was a misunderstanding,
the girl cried, picking up her knives.
They were disturbing the peace, and I wasn't sure if I could believe their story, so we thought it would be best to bring them in, and then they attacked us.
You are dismissed,
the supervisor barked, waving his hand. His long sleeves cast shadows on the wall behind them.
We will discuss this later.
May I? Kai stopped himself, swallowing. He tried again. May I speak to her first, good sir?
About what? If you're going to cause another altercation—
No, sir, Kai hastened to say. She was a friend of mine from the academy. It's a personal matter. The girl finally looked at him fully, staring unabashedly. Was that hope Aranya saw in her eyes? Or merely gladness for the acknowledgement?
If she will speak to you, very well. But I will not wait around.
Of course not, Delon said, taking Aranya's elbow and guiding her toward the supervisor. We will discuss what happened with you and request safe passage while we're in your city. Aranya didn't look back at the dissipating wardens, or at Kai, and followed mutely after the supervisor into the ward post. The door shut behind them.
What is this that you have done, misleading my good wardens, which you call my incompetent lackeys, and causing multiple scenes?
The supervisor asked sourly, positioning himself on his mat behind his desk. Despite how these walls weren't whitewashed like in Sushui, but instead a natural wood, buffed and stained to shine, it was eerily close to standing before Qigong and defending herself with silent Kai. Aranya tensed up. Thankfully, Delon took the lead and explained the situation, from her getting kidnapped and bound with magical vines, how they were trying to get them off, to their unfruitful visit to the Cursebreaker's hut.
She's not bound anymore,
the supervisor observed with lowered eyebrows. The flickering candlelight made his eye sockets seem unusually deep, and his brow especially prominent. Aranya's face heated. She lowered her gaze slightly, wishing she could close her ears too, when Delon said,
Well, the young man who retrieved you thought to try a different approach and use the Yanjiao technique to break the bonds. It worked.
At this, the supervisor snorted.
Never underestimate the power of the Yanjiao technique, I always say.
Delon chuckled. Her cheeks burned. He continued the tale, explaining the confusion with the wardens. Aranya expected him to berate the wardens' performance, call them incompetent lackeys again, but instead he blamed it on a misunderstanding. He was trying to not offend the supervisor a second time, she realized. Faster than she anticipated, the supervisor waved his hand.
I apologize for this misunderstanding. My wardens meant well, I assure you. Sometimes the newer ones can be a little over-enthusiastic, which I will address with them. You may be on your way. Fathers bless your journey.
Delon and Aranya bowed before hastening to slip out of his office. Once outside again, surrounded by the darkness and coolness of late evening, voices carried from nearby. Charged, angry, somewhat hushed, but increasing in volume. Two shadows stood near the edge of the ward post. Kai and the girl. Aranya sighed, rolling her eyes.
That boy needs a lesson on keeping his professional and personal lives separate,
Delon muttered. Aranya said nothing. One voice rose to a shrilling peak, contrasting the opposing low tones. A sharp slap punctuated the exchange. Aranya jumped at the sound, at the sudden silence that followed. Delon went quiet, not moving a muscle. The girl's following words were clear in the night.
I hate you.
Chapter 4. They tromped in silence to an inn, their horses in tow. Aranya and Delon took the front, Kai trailing behind them. The girl had run off, leaving him standing in the darkness. When he'd emerged from the shadows a minute later, he grabbed his horse's reins and started walking. He didn't look at either of them.
I'm going to talk to him,
said Delon. Not tonight, Aranya said quickly. He seems pretty down already. Why was she defending him? She was still mad. It served him right to take a verbal thrashing from Delon after what he'd done.
He's down because of this mess he's created. More reason to discuss these things while they're fresh. I don't like having conversations hanging over our heads.
What about tomorrow morning? She said, and immediately hated herself again for how quickly the defenses leapt to her lips.
Kai is not a sniveling little boy to be coddled. He's a grown man and can take it. If he can't, then perhaps he shouldn't be here.
Aranya bit her lip. How long had she been wishing for a supervisor to take her side against Kai? She didn't feel as triumphant as she expected, nor did it satisfy her fury. Not when she glanced back and saw the dejected stoop of his shoulders. Did he still have feelings for that girl? She didn't think so. The sudden kiss and the fear seemed to indicate he didn't love her anymore. Yet, if not, what had they been talking about? She had the odd inclination to slow her pace, match it to Kai's, and ask him what was going on. Maybe he'd want to talk about it. As soon as she had the thought, she shook her head. Unlikely. Kai loved his secrets. The inn was busy after dark, but even though it was still full of the roughened drinking crowd, it was tamer than the first inn they'd stayed at. Delon marched up to the counter, Aranya at his heels. Kai had taken the horses for stabling, and said with a big sigh,
2 rooms, please.
Welcome! 2 rooms, yes. Let me pull your keys for you. Aranya managed to withhold her gasp of relief that they would not have to repeat the last time, except this time with 3 people crammed into 1 room instead of 2. Delon completed the transaction and ordered 2 steaming bowls of meaty stew and rice with a few side dishes. What about Kai? She asked.
He can get his own.
Kai entered the inn just as she and Delon were settling down at one of the low tables in the back of the inn. Aranya winced as she knelt on the mat, her whole body protesting with the movement, especially her ankles, which didn't burn as bad as her wrists, but still hurt nonetheless. She waved Kai over and held up her bowl. You can order one, she told him, taking a sip. He turned to Delon and held out his hand.
Key, I'm going straight up.
Delon regarded him through lowered brows. Kai met his gaze steadily. The older man sighed, pulling 1 key out of his robes.
This one is yours and mine.
He pulled the 2nd key out and slid it across the table to Aranya.
This one is yours.
Kai accepted the key and turned to leave, but Delon caught his wrist.
Don't go to sleep immediately. We'll be speaking once I finish supper.
A muscle jerked in Kai's jaw, but he nodded and left. Once he was gone, Delon pulled a few coppers off his cord and slid them across the table to Aranya.
Get yourself some salve for your wrists, if there isn't enough in the saddlebags.
I'm pretty sure we have enough, Aranya said, pushing them back.
Keep them anyway. Separate from your personal funds, of course. But you ought to have some of your own, in case we're separated again.
She met Delon's eye, nearly cocking her head. Did he trust her? Respect her as a comrade? Was this him proving himself protective of her? Or did he simply doubt her ability to avoid getting kidnapped again? She accepted the coins and slid them onto her cord. Then, quickly, she slurped up the rest of her stew and picked the key off the table. I'll head upstairs too. Good night. There were still the saddlebags to rifle through for some salve and bandages, but she wanted to deposit her satchel in her room first. The hallway was darkened, and the loudness of the downstairs lobby dimmed to a background buzz. Despite the dark, she could not miss the shadow outside 1 room. The quietness only emphasized the key jiggling in the lock. Forget how to use a key? Aranya said. Kai looked up, blinked, and yanked the key out of the lock.
I think they gave us the wrong key.
His hand shook. Her eyes flitted back up to his face. She forced a small smile onto her own. I've never known a locked door to keep Kai out. Pretend the kiss never happened. He glared at her, holding out his hand.
Give me your key. Maybe you got the rooms mixed up.
When she obliged, he stuck that key in the lock and it immediately turned. The door swung open into an even darker room, revealing that the innkeeper hadn't even bothered to leave embers glowing in the hearth or light a single candle.
The first rule of evanescing, Kai muttered, is always knowing where you're going and what's waiting for you there.
I suppose it's not your habit, then, to evanesce into random rooms? Unless they're mine, of course. She expected him to ignore her and keep pouting. Instead, a lopsided grin split his face, white teeth flashing in the darkness as he moved to the next door and tried his key. It worked.
It wouldn't be a random room if I knew you were in it.
She cocked her head, not sure if this was some sort of veiled compliment. Instead of puzzling that out, her curiosity got the better of her. Though Kai's grin was smooth, it couldn't hide everything. She blurted, "What was that girl's name?" His head lifted, his back tensing as his hand froze on the doorknob.
I prefer not to talk about her.
What is her name?
Gia.
He swung open Aranya's door and went back to his. Why were you so... Did she dare say it? Why were you so scared of her? He flinched, halting in the doorway of his and Delon's room. It was too dark to tell for certain, but it looked like he chewed the inside of his cheek. Then he turned, leaned his back against the doorframe, and crossed his arms over his chest. He hid his shaking hands in the folds of his robes.
I'll tell you, if you tell me what happened to your family,
he said. My family? Aranya repeated, blinking. What about them?
Why is it just you and your grandfather? Where are your parents, siblings, aunts, uncles, cousins?
For a strange reason, she found herself flushing. It took her a moment to gather a coherent response. Why do you want to know? She managed, eventually.
Why do you care about that girl?
Because you kissed me despite her. So much for pretending that it never happened. In the space between their words, jeering laughter floated up from the floor below them, wrapping around them and then vanishing into the darkness.
It was not for spite,
he said, so quietly she almost missed it. Not for spite? Then why? She felt his glare more than she saw it.
If you won't tell me about your family, then I won't tell you about Gia.
Why do you care about my family? Kai pushed off the doorframe and stepped into his room.
This conversation, he said, already closing the door, is going in circles. Good night, Partial.
He shut it in her face. She stared for several seconds at the closed door. Then, after releasing a huff, she made her way to her own room, dumped her satchel on the floor, and set about lighting a small fire with the provided wood and tinder. While she was working, more footsteps stomped up the stairs and down the hallway. Delon. The door next to hers opened and shut. Voices. Aranya paused her work as Delon's irate tone drifted through the thin walls. The conversation started too quiet for her to hear, but it quickly grew loud enough that she could make out some words.
What were you thinking?
A muffled response.
There is a code of conduct for comrades of the opposite gender that you've blatantly disregarded. As our partner, Aranya deserves your respect. And for that matter, that other girl deserves your respect too. You could have landed us in jail, boy!
A louder but still muffled response.
This does have to do with her. She's not a pretty girl to flirt with at the academy.
This time, Kai's response was clear.
I wasn't flirting with her. Kissing isn't flirting. That wasn't why I kissed her. 7 Fallies!
Kai sounded mad. Madder than she'd nearly ever seen him. She certainly hadn't ever heard him talk back to Qigong.
Professional and personal relationships stay separate, boy. Never court someone you work with. They taught you that at the academy, right? Or have they gone lax on that too?
Silence. When Delon began speaking again, his voice was lower and harder to distinguish. She could only catch snatches of it.
Fun to tease. I tease her too. But you're a handsome young man. Extra careful. Your actions are clearly only... This mission is turning out to be far more dangerous than any of us. I need you and her to both... heads screwed on straight to your shoulders. Done with this mission, and back at Sushui you can have all the... but not here. While we're trying to prevent someone from conquering our people.
Whatever Kai said in response was not discernible, but it was obviously exasperated. Aranya didn't blame him, even as she blushed furiously that this was what Delon was berating him for. Did he think her so stupid as to be won over by flirting and a single kiss? Perhaps he didn't respect her as much as she'd earlier thought. Did he also truly think that Kai would ever think of her that way? She might have believed it for a split second when he kissed her, but definitely not anymore. Whatever Young had been talking about regarding Kai's feelings had been nonsense. She had seen the look on Kai's face when they'd pulled away from their kiss. That hard coldness. She'd heard his taunts of making her beg for another kiss. In Kai's mind, she was just another girl to be toyed with. The voices grew more muffled. She waited, her hands still gripping the tinderbox, but there was no more to hear. She finished up lighting the fire, glad to finally have something to blame for the warmth of her cheeks. Then she stood up, drew her cloak around her shoulders, and swept downstairs to find the salve for her wrists.